just came back from a short sabbatical in Melbourne, Australia. And, you know, Melbourne, there's a very lively restaurant scene there. And I went to a very good Italian restaurant, and I was served a very large plate of wonderful pasta, which I couldn't finish. So I asked them for a doggy bag or to take away. And then the waiter told me, I'm sorry, but the law here in Victoria, in Australia, makes it impossible. It is banned to take away food or to take a doggy bag. I thought that perhaps it's some oddity that has to do with this particular restaurant, but I tried it in another restaurant, which was not Italian, and the same answer was given to me. So I was really impressed. I mean, think about it, a society that protects you from leaving your pastrami in a car for several hours for too long, and then getting sick. They protect you there in Melbourne, Australia, from getting sick. So when I came back to Israel, I looked into the matter, and I found out that although there is not a specific law that says you cannot, you are forbidden from giving away food, there is a plan made by the government with disclaimers that the diners can sign or have to sign, and some advice, and there's a whole issue about it in Melbourne. And again, that made me think about the general issue of when does society intervene? When is it the duty of society to protect us from something? So that's the first story. And now I want to remind you about another story you all know about, because you experienced parts of it during the recent years. Some of you may remember that years ago, not so many years ago, but years ago, we took flights and the plane was saturated with smoke. We could have a long or a short flight, and then if we were not enjoying the smoking as the few people that were sitting back there, we just, I mean, it was unpleasant. And not just airplanes, everywhere. A place like that could be, in these days, saturated with smoke. And we all know it's very different now. We know that laws all over the world ban smoking in public places. And this is something that is ever widening. So I'm asking myself, how did it happen? Because the knowledge about smoking being dangerous to you, causing cancer and other very unpleasant stuff, this is something that was known for many years. Many years before the actual ban of smoking was introduced. So what was changed? What caused the change? Well, I believe that the reason for the change is really a change of narrative. There was a reversal of the prevailing narrative about smoking. If the old narrative was a story about autonomy, smoking is something that I'm entitled to choose to do because I'm a grown-up adult and I can decide for myself whether I want to take the risk of cancer or I don't want to take the risk of cancer, and that was the dominant narrative. Now, this narrative changed. it was reversed into a much more complex, a richer narrative that includes many other parts, many other components, like, am I damaging others? Am I damaging society at large? And if I am damaging others and society at large, what is the duty of society to protect these other individuals and the society itself? So the change of narrative made the change of law possible. What does it have to do with prostitution? Well, I think that the story of prostitution is one of these stories that are going to change the prevailing story about prostitution. And I'm going to tell you in a minute what is the prevailing story about prostitution, should and would eventually be changed and be transformed into another narrative that will evolve into changing the law. Well, what is the story of prostitution? I'd say the normal, or the story that most people will declare as or think about as the main story about prostitution, as the way that defines the fashion in which they perceive prostitution, is what I name the liberal story. What is the liberal story? The liberal story is a story about a transaction. It is mainly a transaction between two consenting adults that decide, while they are both in the same equal standing, that this is the transaction that they are both interested in, and in our case, the transaction is buying and selling sex. So, nothing wrong about it. This is the essence of liberal thought, this is the essence of autonomy, this is the essence of human rights, on the face of it. The other story, which I think is the true story about prostitution, is the social infamy story. In order to demonstrate what is the social infamy story, what do I mean by saying a social infamy story, I want to ask you to do two things for a minute. Try to think about narrative, about stories that have to do with prostitution and yourselves. Try to think about a situation in which you discover that your mother, your daughter, your sister, or another woman who is very close to you is in prostitution. You suddenly discover that. What would you feel? Really try to do that. And now try to do another thing. Try to imagine a story in which you yourself engage in prostitution. What would it take? Try to imagine a situation in which you choose, you agree, or you consent to engage in prostitution. Try to think about it, to form this imaginary narrative. Well, I asked my students these two questions, to do these two things. They said it is very difficult for them, it was difficult for them to come with answers. When they did, the answers actually were similar. I'll give you just two examples. One of my students, a young man, said, the only script I can imagine, the only story I can think about is that he has a 2-year-old girl, that somebody will come with a gun and point it to my little girl's head and tell me that if I want to go into prostitution, he'll shoot my daughter. This situation is the only one, or such situation is the only one that comes to my mind. Another answer came from a woman, and she said, the only way I can imagine myself engaging in prostitution is thinking about a pretty woman. You know, the Julia Roberts famous Cinderella story about a woman in prostitution that met her savior, that met Richard Gere, that it was like really a Cinderella miracle, took her out of the gutter of Los Angeles and made her a rich, respectable, and happy woman. So that was her answer, which is very interesting. All the students talked about shame, about loss of dignity, about really awful feelings when they tried to imagine, to make it their own story. Now, what did they feel? What did they try to imagine? What do you feel if you really try to think about, to imagine the things I asked you to imagine? I think that what you felt is the effect of social infamy. How prostitution makes people in prostitution feel. So social infamy is something really terrible, and the question is, why does it exist? I don't know. I don't think that prostitution is something that deserves social infamy. I don't think that there's something inherent to prostitution that deserves any moral condemnation, or that this toll or this price of social infamy is just. It is not just. I don't know why it exists. There are many possible reasons that has to do with gender issues, with sex issues, with psychological issues. I don't know what the reason is, but I know it exists. I know that social infamy exists, and I know that it is being ignored. It is being ignored. It is not being acknowledged by most societies who say that prostitution is something that we can handle basically by this liberal narrative. Well, not all societies. There's one society that changed the law because they acknowledge this alternative narrative. It started in Sweden. Sweden changed the law more than 10 years ago. The law in Sweden is that prostitution is illegal because it is considered to be violence. It is considered to be abuse of women. It is considered to be something that cannot be perceived as a job or an occupation. Think about it. Would you, even if you somehow manage to convince yourself to go into prostitution, would you put it into your CV? Would you write down that during this year, what I did, my experience was being a prostitute? So in Sweden, it's very clear. In Sweden, they changed the law. Prostitution is illegal, but only the clients are responsible, are being prosecuted. This model, which was perhaps considered radical at that time, has now spread to other states in Scandinavia. Norway changed the law 3 years ago. Iceland changed it. So now it was first the Swedish model, but now we can call it the Nordic model because it's almost all over Scandinavia. And the data is very good. The data is very good because the Swedish government published a report a few weeks ago saying that examining the data from the last 6 years, there are less than half of the number of prostitutes in Sweden is less than half, and more than 70% of the public, the Swedes, are all for the law. They say it's a very good law. So, on the face of it, there's a solution. Let's change the law and solve the problem. But it's not that simple, it's not that easy, because before we change the law, we must change the narrative. Law and narrative must work together. The narrative now is, the prevailing narrative is narrative that makes a legal change almost impossible because it will not be accepted. Before we change the law, we must do certain actions, like what I'm doing now, of course, in wider circles, in order to change the prevailing narrative and exchange it with a new one. It is very difficult because most people would say it is not a realistic goal. Why isn't it realistic? Well, they say prostitution is the oldest occupation. As it is relevant. I don't know why it is relevant, but people always say that. Some people say men are men and men will always be men. People in Israel say, we are not Sweden. We cannot do what was done in Sweden. And there are all sorts of things that people say in order to convince themselves and others in society that this change is not realistic. I think it is a realistic change, and I think about other situations in history, like slavery, like child labor, like not giving women the right to vote, like abusing women, harassing women, sexual harassment of women. These were all things that were considered as normal and unchangeable, and they did change. I believe that the same will happen with prostitution, with aid of narrative, with the help of narrative, as a lever of change, as something that will change after we change our narrative. And I want to sum up with a question, which is sort of a challenge. Try to think about some other prevailing narratives that could and should be changed to make our lives better. Thank you.